Multimedia Feedback. So you have received a project from a student in your class, and now you want to give feedback. Now, multimedia can be a very useful and very helpful tool for providing feedback to either supplement or replace the traditional written comments that you might put on a student project. But in order to do the feedback effectively, we need to talk a little bit about some general strategies for responding to student writing and student projects. Now, feedback and assessment and student response is such an important topic that we actually have an entire course devoted to that in our OWI certification program. So we're not going to go into anywhere near as much depth in a short video as we do in that whole course. But with the help of Beth Hewitt, I want to share with you a few strategies. These are based on a lot of research that I've done, as well as many years of experience of writing on student papers and trying to give them feedback that actually will help them revise and improve their papers, which is one of the hardest things we have to do, honestly, in teaching writing online or teaching really any subject online. So my 4 primary suggestions are these. First of all, to align the feedback with the learning outcomes and evaluation rubric for the assignment. So for example, let's say you're teaching visual storytelling through a photo essay. You want your feedback to line up with the rubric and with the criteria that you set up at the beginning of that project. So if your criteria was all about the use of visuals and about the arrangement of the story, you don't want to come back with a bunch of feedback that is locally granular or focused on something else. To the extent that it's possible, you want the learning outcomes, the rubric, and the feedback that you're giving all to line up so that the student knows this is what I was trying to accomplish in this project, these were my goals, and the feedback is clearly related to those goals. It sounds simple in theory. In practice, it's pretty hard. It takes some real thought, and sometimes I will literally be staring at the rubric and try to remind myself, okay, what are the criteria? And how do I best align them? So, for example, if you're teaching an analysis project and one of the key criteria in your rubric is, effectively breaks something down into its elements for the purposes of analysis, then you say your project really did a great job of breaking down into the elements so that you could do the analysis, except for this one piece, which I thought was really confusing. So even to the point of literally using the same words. Part number 2 is to focus on higher order concerns. Giving feedback to a student is not copy editing. Resist the urge to copy edit the paper. The grammar errors are noise, and students will get overwhelmed very, very, very quickly and sort of feel like they're not very good writers if you're correcting every comma splice and every spelling error. Don't do it. Focus on the higher order concerns, global issues of organization, strategy, style, arrangement, all of those things that are in your rubric, right? Try to resist that tendency to get down to sentence level, unless that's really the focus of your project. If your project is really to teach editing, documentation, and some sentence level, lower order concerns, then by all means focus on them in keeping with that first alignment goal. But by and large, as a writing instructor, if you're going to help the students, you're going to focus on these big picture things. Number 3 is to emphasize 2 or 3 main suggestions focused on revisions to improve the project, right? Don't point out everything that's wrong with the paper. Again, you'll just overwhelm the student. Pick the 2 or 3 things that are most important and would make the most difference, and really spend your time and energy, whether you have 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever you have, to give feedback to that student. Pick the 2 or 3 things that are going to make the most difference, and then try to help that student see how they can actually make revisions that are going to lead to an improvement in that paper, in that multimodal project. And then finally, remember Beth Hewitt's concept of what, why, how, do, which she presents in chapter 13. So let's dive into that chapter in a little bit more detail. And I really want to pull out a few strands, do some close analysis of Beth Hewitt's chapter about giving feedback, because I think they're great suggestions that we can apply to both written text and to multimodal assignments when we give feedback. Okay, so up on the screen here is the PDF of Beth Hewitt's Chapter 13 called Providing Readable Instructional Feedback Online. This is a masterful chapter. It's really a workshop in 18 pages. It's a fantastic workshop in how to provide effective feedback on student writing. Some of this applies to on-site courses as well, but she focuses specifically on some of the challenges when we're online. So let me pull out a few sentences here and highlight some pieces that I think are really valuable, and then I'll leave you to read the rest of the chapter yourself. But I want to share with you some things that I think are particularly important. And she says in her opening section here, as highlighted in green on the screen here, she says, while somewhat true in an on-site setting, in an online setting, instructional feedback represents more than the response to one paper. It becomes a significant individualized part of the teaching. Feedback becomes the one-to-one interaction between the student and the teacher, just as it is in a peer-to-peer or student-to-tutor situation. So when you're giving feedback, particularly if you're using screencast modality, you are kind of tutoring the student. And if you do take the time to record an audio or video, I guarantee you they will feel that you've given them a lot of attention, even though with practice it actually takes less time to do something multimodally than it takes to do a lot of written feedback. But that's the important difference between the on-site and online, that is the teaching, right? The feedback is the teaching. And Beth goes on to elaborate that here by saying the strategies for feedback presented in this chapter certainly are helpful to students regardless of whether the course occurs online or on-site. However, since the feedback in OWI typically is provided via text, even when supplemented by audio or video files, without a face-to-face opportunity for teachers to explain their intentions, online writing students are at great risk of misinterpreting the feedback. And those of you who have taught online writing courses for any length of time know how true this is, right? Students are at great risk of misinterpreting the feedback. How often do you get an email or a panicked phone call from a student saying, I don't understand what you meant. What did I do wrong? I am lost. You may have thought your feedback was really clear and you totally rocked it on their assignment, and then they're completely lost because there's just a limited bandwidth of connection between you and that student. That you can't really replicate the experience of the face-to-face writing conference. That's where some of this multimodal stuff comes in really handy, because you can put their paper up on the screen, put their project up on the screen, and walk through it as if you were in a face-to-face tutoring session with that student. But as it says here, there's a great risk of misinterpretation. So she goes on to elaborate and say, for the most part, teachers can adapt the feedback strategies recommended in this chapter to their preferred response approaches. However, as the examples demonstrate, and I'm going to look at one of the examples in a minute, this book favors an approach that addresses higher order, content and organization-based concerns first, and more substantially, before addressing lower order sentence-level problems in an essay. Additionally, it favors a problem-centered, linguistically direct instructional style in OWI that teaches students what a problem is, why it is a problem, and how to fix it or avoid it, while clearly telling students what they should do through a series of next steps. That's the crux. That's really the thesis of this chapter. This is the model of feedback that Beth is going to demonstrate and really break down into steps. Is this what she calls problem-centered, linguistically direct instructional style? So what does that look like then? First of all, she breaks down what she calls response elements that all students need from their teachers. And this is almost like a checklist. A personal greeting. Hi, Beth. Acknowledgement of their efforts in terms of praise or some positive comment. I really like what you did in this paper. I can see that you're trying to express a story, whatever. Start with the positive. A summary of what the writing seems to be about to provide a sense of how a real reader is understanding it. I really like the way you connect your personal story with these photos from Time magazine in the civil rights era. Again, you're describing what you see in the writing. And then a sense of how the writing is working globally in terms of content, context, argument strategy, and the like. Here's where you're beginning to drill into the project and say, these things are working globally, these things are not. The content is great, the argument is unclear. The context, whatever you need to say, but again, notice the focus is globally, not locally. And then, to a lesser degree, depending on the stage of the writing, a sense of how the writing, or in our case, multimodal, the composition, is working at the local or sentence level. Again, I can't say this enough. The global stuff is more important than the local details, almost always. And then finally, The takeaway for the students is to give them a lesson or lessons about how to make some type of revision that will take the paper to the next level of competence, and an action plan or a series of next steps. Now that's a lot. You won't be able to do all of that in every piece of feedback, but this bullet list of response elements that Beth has identified here is a pretty solid. I mean, if you can do 3 or 4 or 5 of these things, particularly if you focus on these last two, to give a little mini lesson about some type of revision that will take the paper to the next step, and an action plan, you need to do the following: 1, 2, 3. Again, I like threes. People can remember threes, probably no more than 3 next steps. Clean up this introduction, clarify your thesis, and write a better conclusion. Might be an example of an action plan. Again, I'm not going to read through all the details because I want you to go back and really spend some time with this chapter. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to, sorry for all the scrolling, is this. This is the heart of this chapter, the what, why, how, do. As Beth says, there are 4 steps to the writing intervention process. 1, what? What is the problem? I lost track of your argument right here. Number 2, why is it a problem? Because I couldn't follow what you were trying to say. How can this problem be revised or avoided? You need to rearrange the organization of your paper and clarify your thesis. Do these steps to address the problem. Go back and find your thesis, reorganize your paragraphs, and clarify the conclusion of your paper to reiterate the thesis that you made at the beginning. I'm just making this up as an example of how I might apply the what, why, how, do to a student who had written an argument that kind of went off the rails organizationally. But that what, why, how, do model proves to be pretty darn effective. And it's easy to remember, right? What, why, how, do. You can remember it already. What is the problem? Why is it a problem? How can it be revised and avoided? And then do, when leaving students with that action steps. Now, finally, I want to draw your attention to these 2 examples because they're great. Example 13.3 and example 13.4 are intended to be a comparison and contrast. 13.3 is what she calls the original feedback strategy. And so this is a student paper from a student named Bob, and the instructor here in this example is giving feedback to Bob. The text in the box is literally this instructor's feedback to Bob. And if you read through this at first, you might go, wow, that's pretty good feedback, right? That's pretty detailed. But Beth comes back to say that there are some real problems with this, and despite the fact that it looks pretty helpful, it's actually not meeting her standards. And what she says is, basically, she identifies some problems and says, in short, in example 13.3, in short, Bob has been left to his own understanding of the feedback, which may be as minimal as his early drafts writing development. In an OWI setting, given the typical lack of interpersonal communication between Bob and his teacher, he is on his own to revise this essay to the best of his abilities. So from Beth Hewitt's point of view, as good as the feedback might look in this 13.3 example, it's not good enough. It leaves too much unsaid, and it leaves Bob too much on his own. So how does she say we should do it better then? All right, Beth Hewitt, what do we do better? And she provides this example right here, example 13.4, recommended feedback strategy. Same student, same paper, but a better job of identifying this and exemplifying that 4-part what, why, how, do model. So you can read through this and see how you think it compares to 13.3 and why you think it's better. But what Beth says is, notice how it ends with next steps for revision, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Find your thesis, locate your reasons and evidence, revise the essay with this thesis and set of reasons, work on the documentation, spell check, proofread, and present your next draft in its best possible form. So she's left, in this case, the instructor has left Bob with a very concrete list of 5 things. That's the do, the what, why, how, do. And then there's some of the feedback in the margins of the paper. Notice there's considerably less feedback on the paper itself in 13.4 than there was in 13.3. And the conclusion here says, OWI writing example 13.4 looks like a long response to a student essay, yet it took less than 30 minutes to read the essay and write the response. And it is about equal in length to OWI writing example 13.3, given that response's wealth of embedded comments. 30 minutes, by the way, is the average for me. And she goes on to talk about the whole issue of time. If you're teaching 3, 4, 5 I have a friend who teaches 7 writing classes at one time. Obviously, you got to maximize your time. And the strategies here, the what, why, how, do, I think ultimately will help you do that. Because she says writing a problem-centered essay response always will take longer than speaking it, but a text-based response has its own benefits. Written text forces instructors to be targeted and focused in our feedback. A problem-centered response requires clear examples. Students can reread this feedback. Even though there's no magic potion to make writing feedback easier and faster, there are some helpful strategies, and she goes on to identify some of those here. But I think the what, why, how, do model can really help you be more efficient in your feedback. And if you limit the comments in written text to specific local points where you want to say, this is where I got lost, this sentence is unclear, this paragraph loses the train of thought, these paragraphs seem out of order, you can use a combination of text-based feedback and audio or visual feedback for the big picture. So the way I would do this if I was giving multimedia feedback is I would basically summarize these revision steps and share with the student the overview feedback in a verbal oral form in some kind of audio or perhaps video feedback to Bob. I might even almost read this as a script. And then I would share the local feedback in the form of text-based comments. But I really wanted to spend a little time kind of highlighting some pieces in Hewitt's chapter 13 because I think it's so good and so helpful. And it will be a challenge if you haven't thought about writing feedback this way in the past, shifting gears from copy editing and micro level stuff to the big picture and really trying to say to yourself, what are the 2 things or 3 things that are going to make the biggest difference and make this a more effective paper? It's not easy. You're not going to get it right the first time. And, I've been doing it for 20 years and I'm still really pretty lousy at it. But hopefully these strategies from Hewitt will help you think about some of the ways to connect what you're trying to achieve in a teaching unit with the kind of feedback that you give to the student. Okay, thanks for listening to this somewhat long and detailed video. I hope it's helpful for you as you begin thinking about giving feedback to your student.